Boston is a city that breathes history. It's arguably the birthplace of the Revolution, with its freedom trails, tea parties, and dead founders like the one right next to me. If you follow me on social media, then you know I'm from Boston, and I never shut up about this place. So, of course, when a bunch of history YouTubers decided they wanted to make videos about their hometown history, it was obvious what I'd do. Today's video is a part of the Project Homecoming 2 collaboration, and for my contribution, I'm talking about the Native Americans of Boston, the Wampanoag. We're going to learn about their religion, mainly their hero figure Moshup, his family, and some other gods in the pantheon. Now, before we get into the mythology, I want to explain who the Wampanoag were, so that way we're all on the same page. If you know anything about the Wampanoag, then it's almost certainly because you know the story of the first Thanksgiving, back when Europeans first arrived in what is today Massachusetts. Obviously, the Wampanoag were around long before that, though. In fact, there's evidence of human habitation in the area dating back as far as 12,000 years ago. It's unlikely these people back then were related to the Wampanoag of today, since humans have a habit of migrating around areas, but we'll never know for sure. All we do know is that the Wampanoag have been in the South Shore and Greater Boston areas for a wicked long time. The Wampanoag were a semi-nomadic people who set up wherever the weather was nicest during that time of year. In the spring and summer, they'd go down to Cape Cod, and in the winter, they retreat more inland. Native borders were kind of fuzzy since they were so used to moving around a lot, and nations would sometimes share land on the fringes of their territories, but they still had claimed territories. At this point in history, what we call Boston was the Shawmut Peninsula, and much of what is today Boston was actually a river or bay area. Summer had plenty of fish to catch, but if you know New England winters, you know it was not the nicest place to be during that time of year, and as a result, people didn't live here year-round. There were also a few different nations that occupied the Shawmut Peninsula, including the Massachusetts, take a wild guess where we got the state name from, the Pawtucket, and the Wampanoag. Now, one more bit of history house cleaning before we begin. The Wampanoag, along with the other two I just mentioned, were all Algonquian people in the northeastern woodlands. A lot of the nations in this area had similar beliefs, just some variation of the names. Kind of like the Greeks and the Romans. Similar, but not the same. Almost all of our sources on the Wampanoag religion come from the Wampanoag of Martha's Vineyard in Cape Cod. But, by comparing their Moshup's deeds to the stories of the Moshup from the Mohican tribe and Glooskap, who is the Abenaki equivalent, we see they all follow general trends, tropes, and characters who appear in their stories. It's just all different locations. Now that that disclaimer is out of the way, we can finally begin talking about the stories. The Wampanoag religion was by no means monotheistic, but like other northeastern woodlands, they had a hero figure who was central to their stories. In the Wampanoag's case, his name was Moshup. It's said that when the Wampanoag first came to what would be their lands in the South Shore, they encountered a giant living with his family. The giant was the father of the family, Moshup, and he had a wife, Squanet, who was probably a sea goddess, based on some of the powers she had involving water. They also had 5 children, 4 sons and 1 daughter. Moshup was a friendly giant who did his best trying to protect the Wampanoag from danger. They loved him and he loved them back, although he wasn't perfect. For instance, when he would get in a fight with his wife, it would get wicked stormy and it'd scare the Wampanoag into hiding until things settled down. Moshup also helped get food for the Wampanoag by beaching whales. I think he got tired of beaching the whales though, because he eventually took on the more direct approach of picking whales out of the water and smacking them against the cliff sides. That's actually why some cliffs in the area have red tints. It's exploded whale guts. There's another story about Moshup where a giant bird kidnapped a bunch of Wampanoag children. This happened multiple times, and he wasn't able to stop the bird at all. Eventually, he got so frustrated that he decided to chase the bird down anyway, and he walked into the ocean to chase after the bird. As he walked through the ocean, remember he's a giant, he eventually saw an island that the bird would land on. By the time he got to the island, the bird was gone again, but he found the skeletal remains of the children who were kidnapped. Moshup's heart shattered upon seeing this, and to numb the pain, he decided to smoke a pipe on the island by himself. Eventually, he did return to the mainland to inform the people of what happened, and the humans sailed out there shortly after to bury their dead. They must have thought the island was pretty nice though, because they made it their new home, and Moshup eventually joined them despite his initial bad impression with the island. This island would eventually be known as Martha's Vineyard. The Wampanoag lived in between this island and on the mainland. Meanwhile, Moshup lived on the island year-round with his family. They ate whales together, and he enjoyed smoking his pipe. Eventually, the Wampanoag people wanted to thank Moshup for being such a nice guardian, so they harvested as much tobacco as they could and gave it to him as a gift. He thanked them for their generosity, even though the amount of tobacco was very small compared to his giant stature, and he smoked it in his pipe anyway. There was so much smoke that the entirety of the Wampanoag lands were covered in a dense fog. And now, whenever fog returns to Massachusetts, the Wampanoag see it as Moshup smoking his pipe. Moshup also dumped the ashes in the water nearby Martha's Vineyard, and that created the island of Nantucket. That's the gist of the story of Moshup. He's a giant terraformer who loves eating whales and protecting his people. But he's not the only god in the Wampanoag pantheon. As mentioned previously, there are his children, who, as far as I can find, don't have names in recorded history, and his wife, Squanet. Unlike Moshup, who was a giant, Squanet was wicked small. She was shorter than most humans even. I mentioned earlier that she had control over the seas and the storms, as evident by whenever she argued with her husband, storms would appear all over New England. The Wampanoag affectionately called her Granny Squanet. Along with those two, there was a creator deity, Katanet, the first sachem. Sachem is a word that was often translated as chief, but it has both political and religious powers. And along with that, men and women could both be sachems. And to the Wampanoag, Katanet was the first sachem. Not much is known about Katanet. They're kind of the usual sky parent, creator deity type deal, vague, formless even. When Christianity first came to the Wampanoag, they translated God as Katanet in the Wampanoag language when translating the Bible. The same thing happened to another Wampanoag deity, Chepi, who was the god of the dead and a shapeshifter from another world. It was said that if a person saw Chepi appear in their dreams, often as a snake, they would become a shaman, a respected yet feared religious figure in Wampanoag society. Normally, you might assume Christians lumping in Chepi with Satan gave him a bad reputation he didn't have prior to conversion. That might be an oversimplification though, because the shamans were complicated figures as I just mentioned, and they drew their power from Chepi. So it's actually hard to tell if Chepi was pure evil before the Europeans arrived, or if he was just a trickster figure like other figures in the Algonquian religions. It's ultimately something we'll never know for sure, but it definitely won't stop historians, anthropologists, and archaeologists from theorizing. One last Moshup story before we go, and as with many Native American stories, this is a story to explain where he went. One day, Moshup's kids were playing on the beach, and he told them to go further out along the peninsula, and because their dad told them to, they obliged. When they got out there, Moshup dragged his foot across the land bridge, creating a massive canal for water to flood into, turning the peninsula into islands. His kids were at first afraid, but Moshup told them to act as if they were going to kill whales, and when he said that, his kids shapeshifted into orcas, and they swam off into the ocean. Squanet was very sad to see her children go, and she wept for so long that she eventually turned into a rock, blending in with the other rocks in the rocky shore. Apparently this was a real rock that looked like a woman, but the settlers chipped away at it over time, and now it's deformed and it doesn't look like a woman. And finally, what happened to Moshup himself? Well, he stayed with the Wampanoag for a bit longer, but right before the Europeans showed up, he vanished. They still say he's out there though. Whenever the fog rolls in, it's Moshup smoking his pipe. Now if you allow me to get a bit historical one last time, some historians argue that Moshup is a symbol of Wampanoag power. He symbolizes their control over the land. When the Wampanoag first arrived in Massachusetts, they had control over the land and the animals in a way no other creatures did, and the only thing that they couldn't control was the weather, which was symbolized by Moshup and Squanet arguing. But then when the Europeans arrived, Moshup vanished along with their control, because now they had challengers. That's one interpretation of Moshup's stories at least. A secular interpretation, but one I think worth mentioning because it's kinda neat. So that was the Wampanoag religion on the eve of the Europeans arriving in Massachusetts Bay. Like I said, Boston breathes history. Stuff has been happening here since before it was called Boston. And now that you've finished my video, I highly recommend you check out others in this playlist, Project Homecoming 2. And if you like this video, definitely subscribe. There's a whole chunk of this video I had to cut for time. It's all about Puritans and how the Wampanoag converted to Christianity. So subscribe and stick around. Anyway, thank you for watching, leave a like if you enjoyed, and subscribe if you want to see more. I have a Discord where I post memes and updates on future videos, and I also have a Ko-fi where you can tip me if you feel so inclined. So until next time, have a good one, and go Bruins.